Who did Napoleon fight in 1812? The question seems absurd, doesn't it? Every school child would answer without hesitation. Russia, the Patriotic War, Kutuzov, Borodino, the burning of Moscow. History written in textbooks with golden letters of patriotism. But what if we open Napoleon's own archives? What if we look into the documents of the French General Staff, into the memoirs of Grande Armée officers, into the Emperor's correspondence? And here begins the first crack in the monolith of familiar history. In Napoleon's documents, there is no word Russia. There appears Tartary, Muscovy, Asian hordes, territories that have nothing in common with the state we know today. Perhaps this is simply an inaccuracy in translation, maybe outdated terminology. Or did the French Emperor fight against something completely different from what we've been told for the last 200 years? Imagine this picture. You enter Marshal Zhukov's office and see in the most honorable place a portrait of Adolf Hitler. Not a caricature, not a propaganda poster, but a solemn ceremonial portrait in a gilded frame. Absurd? Impossible? Sacrilege? Now imagine monuments to the heroes of the War of 1812 crowned with French eagles. Imagine manifestos of the Russian Tsar written in the enemy's language. Imagine jubilee exhibitions where portraits of Alexander and Napoleon are laid out in flowers side by side, as if they were allies rather than mortal enemies. All of this exists. All of this is real. All of this is documented. In this video, more than 10 facts that don't fit the official version of the War of 1812. Facts that call into question the very nature of this conflict. Facts that point to something greater than simply a war between two empires. What if the war was not against Russia, but against Muscovite Tartary? A vanished civilization erased from history so thoroughly that even its name seems like fiction to us. Hit like right now and watch until the end, because what you learn will change your understanding of history forever. The fire that could not happen. Moscow, September 1812. Napoleon enters the ancient capital, expecting to meet a delegation of Moscow boyars ready to present the keys to the city. But the city is empty. And within a few hours begins something that cannot be explained by the laws of physics. Listen to an eyewitness account. Count Philippe Paul de Ségur, an officer of the French General Staff, describes in his memoirs a scene that makes the blood run cold. The general stood on a hill and looked at Moscow. The city was burning, but not as ordinary fires burn. Flames rose to the sky in columns like fiery tornadoes, and above all this hell floated strange luminous spheres, descending now on one quarter, now on another. Wherever they fell, a new source of fire erupted there. Perhaps this is poetic exaggeration from a shocked witness, maybe a trick of inflamed imagination. But here's the strange thing. Russian officers also write about such fiery spheres. From both sides of the front, people observed the same phenomenon. A fiery sphere the size of a carriage descended on Prince Trubetskoy's palace, one of Moscow's most luxurious mansions, and set it on fire. Stone, marble, granite. Stone does not burn, but the palace burned to the ground as if it were made of paper. Ayvazovsky, an artist known for his meticulous historical accuracy, painted a picture of the Moscow fire. On the canvas, flying projectiles of fire are clearly visible above the city. Not sparks, not embers, but flying burning objects of regular shape. Houses exploded by themselves. French sappers entering buildings describe the same sequence. Crackling inside the walls, a bright flash, a trickle of smoke, and a minute later, only ruins. No gunpowder warehouses, no torches. The building simply collapsed from within, as if devoured by an invisible force. Perhaps this was sabotage. Maybe Russian troops mined the city before retreating. But then explain, why did the French extinguish the fire together with the Muscovites? Napoleon threw all his forces into saving the city. His soldiers, risking their lives, burst into burning buildings, organized bucket chains, created fire breaks. Beside them, shoulder to shoulder, worked the remaining inhabitants of Moscow, about 20,000 people who didn't manage to evacuate or didn't want to. Governor General Rostopchin was unjustly accused of setting fire to the city, accused by his own government. A man who had given Moscow years of service suddenly became a scapegoat. Until the end of his life, he tried to clear his name, published memoirs with evidence of innocence, collected witness testimonies, but his voice drowned in the chorus of official history. The scale of the catastrophe is horrifying. Only 1/3 of Moscow survived. 2/3 of the ancient capital turned to ash in 39 days. Napoleon lost 30,000 men, as many as at the Battle of Borodino. Think about this. Standing in a burning city claimed as many lives as the largest battle of the war. Compare with the fire of 1737. Then several thousand wooden houses burned. A real catastrophe for that time. 94 people died. The city recovered in 2 years. In 1812, 30,000 died. Despite the fact that there were incomparably more stone buildings and wooden construction in the center had been banned since the time of Peter the Great. How can wood kill 300 times more people than stone? And here's what's most striking, the behavior of people. Memoirists from both sides describe the same picture. Russian and French soldiers wandered around the outskirts of the burning city like sleepwalkers, immersed in a trance of horror. They didn't see enemies in each other. They warmed themselves at common fires, shared bread and water, silently watched the fiery hell consuming one of Europe's oldest cities. The fire was disadvantageous to both sides. Napoleon lost his base for wintering, food supplies, strategic advantage. Russian command lost a cultural center, an economic hub, a symbol of national pride. Who needed this? Who could benefit from Moscow turning into a funeral pyre? And after the fire came continuous rains, for weeks, as if the heavens wept over what had happened. This was not an ordinary fire. This was the first mystery. Questions without answers. Now let's go beyond the fire itself and look at the war as a whole. Because the more questions you ask, the less logic remains in the official version. Why did Napoleon, a brilliant commander who won dozens of campaigns, march on Russia? His main opponent, strategic enemy, source of all problems, Great Britain, the island nation that finances coalitions against France, strangles with a continental blockade, stands behind every conspiracy. Logic suggests invade Britain, land on the islands, deprive the enemy of their stronghold. But Napoleon goes east, across all of Europe, to the borders of the unknown. Perhaps he wanted to weaken England's ally? But then why not St. Petersburg? The capital of the empire is much closer to the borders. Its defense is weaker. Taking the northern capital would mean political capitulation. But the emperor stubbornly moves toward Moscow, as if drawn there by something greater than strategic calculations. And here's another oddity. What Moscow boyars were supposed to meet Napoleon on Poklonaya Hill? The boyar class was abolished almost 100 years before this. Peter I created a new system of ranks, a new aristocracy. By the beginning of the 19th century, the word boyar was an archaism, a museum term. Why do French documents stubbornly speak of boyars? What if there really existed in Moscow a power incompatible with the Petersburg table of ranks? Another absurdity, the myth of wooden Moscow. All canonical texts insist Moscow burned because it was wooden. But wooden construction in the center was banned under Peter the Great, after a series of devastating fires. By the beginning of the 19th century, the center was built up with stone mansions, palaces, churches. Wooden houses remained only on the outskirts. So how could a stone city burn down? And one more inconvenient fact that is usually bashfully hushed up. During the war, peasant uprisings raged throughout central Russia. 67 documented uprisings. Peasants burned landowners' estates, killed managers, refused to pay taxes. They weren't helping the French. They rebelled against their own masters. and these rebellions were brutally suppressed by troops under the command of the Tsar from the House of Romanov. So the war was on two fronts, against an external enemy and against one's own people. Perhaps they just took advantage of the weakening of power. Maybe the peasants decided the time of Tsars had passed and they could seize the land. Or were they rising up against those who betrayed their true rulers, the rulers of Muscovite Tartary? Written sources are easy to forge. Memoirs are written by victors. Archives burn in fires and revolutions. But there is something that cannot be forged so easily. Monuments. Stone. Metal cast in bronze. Carved inscriptions. Material witnesses that speak the truth even when people lie. And here something utterly extraordinary happens. We'll continue in the second part, because what you'll see on these monuments will completely shatter your understanding of the War of 1812. Eagles on enemies' graves, Shevardino Redoubt, the battlefield near Borodino, the place where the blood of thousands of Russian soldiers was spilled, defending their homeland from the invader. Here stands a monument, solemn, majestic, erected by order of the Romanov dynasty. And it is crowned with a French single-headed eagle. Not the double-headed eagle of the Russian Empire. Not an orthodox cross. Not a symbol of Russian military victory. But the heraldic sign of Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who supposedly came to conquer and enslave the Russian people. The monument was erected at the official request of the French government. The Romanovs agreed without hesitation. Imagine, a state that just repelled a mortal threat erects on its soil a monument with the aggressor's symbolism. Is this normal? Let's go further. The monument to Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov, the great commander, savior of the fatherland, symbol of Russian military valor. The field marshal stands in dress uniform, with orders on his chest, his gaze fixed on the distance where the defeated enemy retreats, and above his head, a French eagle. Not the Russian double-headed one. French. Try to imagine a monument to Georgy Zhukov, crowned with the eagle of the Third Reich. Try to imagine how this would be explained to veterans of the Great Patriotic War. What words would historians find? What logic would propagandists invent? But with the War of 1812, this is considered normal. Moreover, no one talks about it. Guidebooks modestly remain silent. Tour guides look away. Historians pretend not to notice the obvious. The crossing at Studenka, the site of the tragic crossing of the retreating French army. Here, according to the official version, Russian troops dealt a crushing blow, drowning thousands of enemies in icy water. The monument at this place depicts both emperors, Alexander and Napoleon, as if they were allies observing a joint operation. Smolensk, a hero city that withstood a brutal siege. A monument to the liberators of Russia from the French invasion, a majestic stele surrounded by bas-reliefs of battles, and at the very top, like a crown of triumph, a French eagle. Now pay attention to the map carved on the Smolensk monument, a map of the Russian Empire of 1812. Look carefully at the eastern borders. They end at the Urals. All of Siberia, the entire Far East, half of Eurasia, just empty space. Not marked as Russian territories, not designated as colonies, just emptiness, as if these lands don't exist. Perhaps the cartographer made a mistake. Maybe the authorities didn't know the exact borders of their empire. Or did the borders really look exactly like that? And to the east of the Urals stretched something else, something that was not part of the Romanovs' Russian Empire. The enemy's language as native. Now let's talk about something even stranger. Language. 1813. The war isn't over yet. The Russian army has only just expelled the French beyond the border, but hasn't yet entered Paris. Hostilities continue. Soldiers are dying. Cities are burning. And here in St. Petersburg is published a luxurious album, Participants in the War of 1812. Portraits of heroes, generals, officers, partisans. Those who defended the fatherland from the invader. The album is printed entirely in French. Not in Russian, not in two languages in parallel, only in French, in the language of the aggressor, in the language of that very Napoleon who just yesterday stood in the Kremlin. Maybe this was an edition for export. Perhaps the album was intended for European courts to show the might of Russian arms, but then explain why were manifestos of Tsar Alexander I published in French? Official decrees of the Russian Emperor, appeals to the people, military orders. 1813, the year of expelling the enemy from native soil. And the Tsar addresses his people in the language of this very enemy. Imagine, 1944, the Red Army liberates Ukraine and Belarus, and Stalin publishes orders in German. Absurd, unthinkable, but in the 19th century, this was the norm. Moreover, the uniforms of both armies were so similar that soldiers couldn't distinguish friend from foe. Denis Davidov, the legendary partisan, hero of the People's War, left memoirs in which he admits an amazing thing. Peasants mistook his detachments for French troops and scattered, hid, refused to help. Why? Because the partisans wore standard military uniform, the very same as the French. Davidov had to redress his men in ordinary Russian clothing, tunics, kaftans, coats. Only after this did the peasants believe that these were their own. Rumor has it that letters from Napoleon to Alexander about unifying the color of uniforms have been preserved, that the emperors agreed in advance on how their troops should look. Why do enemies need uniform standardization? Doesn't this facilitate confusion? Doesn't it create chaos on the battlefield? Or were they not enemies? Jubilees that cannot be. 1912. The centenary of the Great Victory. The Russian Empire prepares for a solemn jubilee. Exhibitions open. Commemorative medals are minted. Albums are published. Monuments are erected. And here's what's striking. Nowhere are there signs of war between two monarchs. The medal for the taking of Moscow, from the collection of the French National Library. Ceremonial, minted for the centenary. It depicts pagan equal-armed crosses, symbols that have no relation to either Orthodoxy or Catholicism. Crosses of some other tradition. Which one? The Borodino battle medal is even more mysterious. It depicts warriors in ancient Roman armor, not in uniforms of the early 19th century, not in cuirasses and shakos of that time, but in equipment worn by Caesar's legions. And there are 3 warriors. 3. If the war was between France and Russia, why are there 3 sides on the medal? Who is the third participant in the conflict? Who does the central figure represent? The one against whom the swords of the other 2 are directed. A commemorative cup in honor of the war's centenary. Exquisite work by Petersburg masters. On the cup are engraved scenes of battles, portraits of heroes, dates of victories. And it's all strange, very strange. The exhibition of 1912 in St. Petersburg shocked contemporaries. In the central hall, they arranged a floral composition, portraits of Alexander I and Napoleon Bonaparte, laid out in living flowers, standing side by side, like brothers. On display cases, commemorative cups, perfume bottles with emblems of the French army, snuff boxes with portraits of Napoleonic marshals. The exhibition subtitle read, Heroism of the French Army in the Campaign Through Russia. Not heroism of Russian resistance, not feat of the liberator people, but heroism of the French army, at an exhibition dedicated to victory over this very army. Try to imagine an exhibition for the 70th anniversary of victory, where portraits of Stalin and Hitler stand side by side, where cups with Wehrmacht symbolism are exhibited, where admiration is expressed for the heroism of fascist invaders. Would this be possible? But in 1912 this was the norm. Paintings and orders that do not lie. A curious painting by an unknown artist has survived. An official meeting, a ceremonial hall. Emperor Alexander I stands next to Napoleon Bonaparte. and Alexander presents to Napoleon Cossacks, Bashkirs, and Kalmyks, literally, as a gift, as tribute, as an offering from vassal to suzerain. The warriors stand before the emperors with uncovered heads. In the presence of monarchs, this was an unacceptable violation of etiquette, a deadly insult. But they don't remove their hats. They look defiantly, as if they recognize the authority of neither one nor the other. Who are they? What if these are not simple soldiers but rulers of territories, representatives of peoples being forced to recognize new power? The last fragments of Muscovite Tartary, accepting the victor's terms. Now let's talk about orders. Russian generals, the very ones who defeated Napoleon, expelled him from Moscow, chased him to Paris, wore orders of Prussia and Austria, states that were Napoleon's allies, states that fought against Russia. Why did Russian heroes wear awards from enemy powers? Maybe these are signs of an earlier alliance received before the war. Possibly. But then why weren't they removed? Why did they continue to be demonstratively worn on dress uniforms, as if they were proud of the connection with those officially considered enemies, bearded ghosts? On old depictions of battles of the War of 1812, a strange detail constantly appears. Warriors with long beards, armed with sabers, spears, and bows. Not rifles, not cannons, not bayonets, but ancient cold weapons and bows that hadn't been used in Europe for 300 years. Who are they? Official history says Cossacks, Bashkirs, Kalmyks, irregular troops of the Russian Empire. But why are they depicted in such numbers? Why do they occupy a central place in battle paintings? Why do artists emphasize their otherness, as if they're not part of the Russian army but a separate force? What if these are the last warriors of Muscovite Tartary? Questions without answers. Until the Centennial Jubilee, the war was not called patriotic. This name appeared only in the 20th century. Before that, documents used terms: French invasion, war with Bonaparte, European campaign. Why did they change the name? What did they want to emphasize? Napoleon carried away from Moscow dozens of tons of gold. This is recorded in the memoirs of French quartermasters. Wagons with treasures moved with the retreating army. But not a single ton of this gold officially reached any European city. It disappeared, dissolved, as if it never existed. The Russian army in Paris behaved surprisingly gently, took no reparations, demanded no trophies, didn't loot palaces. Why did the victor behave so delicately with the vanquished? Moreover, Count Vorontsov, representative of the Russian Tsar, paid debts to French creditors out of his own pocket. 30 tons of silver. Enormous sums. Why would a Russian aristocrat pay off a hostile country's debts? And the final question: why did the Russian elite before the war speak French so widely that nobles sometimes didn't know their native language? Maybe it was just fashion? Perhaps imitation of European culture? Or did they have a common master? The Tartary that never was. On 18th century maps, those published before the War of 1812, one can see an amazing state. It occupies vast spaces from the Urals to the Pacific Ocean. It includes territories of Siberia, Central Asia, parts of China. It is called Tartary. Not Russia, not Muscovy, Tartary, with its own borders, with its own capital, with its own statehood. There existed Muscovite Tartary, the western part of this colossus. It bordered the Romanovs' domains. It controlled ancient Moscow. And after the War of 1812, Tartary disappeared from maps, completely, definitively, as if it had never existed. What if the war was not between France and Russia, but a joint operation to destroy Muscovite Tartary? What if Napoleon and Alexander acted in coordination, one from the west, the other from the east, to erase once and for all from the face of the earth a civilization that didn't fit into the New World Order? What if the Moscow fire was not an accident or sabotage, but something completely different, the application of a technology we cannot explain? What if the history we're told in schools is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide the most important thing? In the early 19th century, an entire civilization was destroyed. In the early 18th century came to power the Romanov dynasty, oriented toward the West. They built a new Russia on European models. They cut beards, changed the calendar, moved the capital, created a new aristocracy. And what became of the old one? History is falsified without problems even now, in the era of the internet and freedom of information. What can we say about the 19th century, when victors wrote history without witnesses? Muscovite Tartary disappeared, but its traces remained in monuments with French eagles, in medals with 3 warriors, in maps with truncated borders, in the language of the elite, in jubilee exhibitions where enemies celebrate together. Traces remained, and they screamed the truth.